A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This abridged version is from the Hindley Reading Library Illustrated Classics Collection. Read for you today by Melissa Abrams. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Stave 2. Chapter 4. The Ghost of Christmas Past. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that he could not tell where the walls ended and the windows began. As he was trying to decide what time it was, he heard the neighboring church clock strike 12. 12! Cried Scrooge. Why, it was past 2 o'clock when I went to bed. It isn't possible that I slept through a whole date and into the next night. No, it must be 12 noon. With that, Scrooge scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He rubbed the frost off it with the sleeve of his dressing gown, but all he could see outside was darkness and fog. There were no noises of people in the street, as there would be if it were noon. Scrooge slowly returned to his bed, more confused than ever. The more he thought about the lost time, the more confused he got. Marley's ghost was a dream, he said over and over again, trying to reassure himself. But each time, he'd follow his own words with a question, or was it? Scrooge lay awake in the darkness while the church chime went 3/4 more past the hour. Suddenly he remembered that Marley's ghost had warned him of a visit when the clock struck 1. That last quarter hour seemed to take so long that Scrooge almost convinced himself that he had dozed off and missed the 1 o'clock bell. Then the deep, dull hour bell struck one long tone. Lights suddenly flashed in his room, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a hand. Scrooge sat bolt upright in bed and found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who had opened the curtains. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet like an old man. Its face was soft and smooth, with no sign of a wrinkle, yet its hair was white and hung down its back. Its arms were long and its hands were strong and muscular. Its legs and feet were bare. A pure white tunic trimmed with summer flowers covered its body, and it held a branch of fresh green winter holly in one hand. But the strangest of all was the jet of light that shone from the top of its head, a light that lit up everything around it. "Are you a spirit, sir, that I was told to expect?" asked Scrooge. "I am," came a soft, gentle voice. "I am the ghost of Christmas past, your past, Ebenezer Scrooge." "And why have you come here?" "For your welfare, Ebenezer Scrooge." "Why, thank you, spirit," said Scrooge, who then thought to himself, "But I think a night of undisturbed sleep would be better for my welfare." The spirit, who surely had the power to hear Scrooge's thoughts, then cried out, "Let us proceed with saving you, Ebenezer Scrooge." And the ghost put out its strong hand and took Scrooge gently by the arm. "Rise and walk with me," it commanded. Scrooge would have liked to argue that the weather and the hour were not appropriate for a walk, that his bed was warm, and that he was wearing only a dressing gown, slippers, and nightcap. But Scrooge found himself unable to resist that gentle grasp, so he rose and followed the spirit to the window. "I am a mortal," cried Scrooge as the spirit prepared to go out the window. "I shall fall." "All I need do is touch you here," said the spirit, touching Scrooge's heart, "and you will not fall anywhere." As the spirit spoke these words, the two passed through the closed window and found themselves far away from the city, standing in an open country road. The city had completely vanished. Not a trace of it was to be seen. The fog and darkness had vanished too, and it was a clear, cold, wintry day with snow covering the fields alongside the road. "Good heavens!" cried Scrooge. "I was born in this countryside and grew up here." And for the next few moments, 1,000 thoughts, hopes, joys, and cares of his childhood passed through his head. "Your lips are trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that on your cheek?" "Only a pimple," muttered Scrooge, unwilling to admit that it was a tear. "Please, spirit, lead me on." "Do you remember the way?" asked the spirit. "Remember it?" cried Scrooge eagerly. "I could walk it blindfolded." "Strange, then, that you have forgotten it for so many years," said the ghost. As they walked along the road, Scrooge recognized every gate, every post, every tree. Soon a little town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some ponies came trotting towards them, with boys on their backs calling happily to other boys in carts driven by farmers. "These are only shadows of things past," said the ghost. "They cannot see us." As the merry travelers got closer, Scrooge knew every boy by name. But why was he so overjoyed to see them? Why did his cold eyes glisten with tears and his heart leap up as the boys went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them wish each other a Merry Christmas? After all, what was merry about Christmas to Ebenezer Scrooge? "That school up ahead is not quite empty," said the spirit. "One single child, neglected by his family and friends, is still there." "I know that," said Scrooge, sobbing. "I know him well." They turned off the main road into a familiar lane and soon approached a large red brick building. A weather vane sat on the roof with a bell hanging from it. The building had seen some very poor days. Most of its rooms were now rarely used. Its walls were damp and covered with moss. Many of its windows were broken, and its gate was rotting. The sheds outside were overrun with grass and chickens strutting through the empty stables. As Scrooge and the spirit entered a door off the dreary hall, they saw a bare room with lines of desks still in position. At a desk sat one lone boy, reading. He had chosen a desk near the weak fire to try to keep warm. Scrooge sat down upon a bench and wept to see his long-forgotten self as a boy. Suddenly, a strange figure appeared outside the schoolroom window. It was a woodcutter, with an axe stuck in his belt. He was leading a donkey loaded down with wood. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" cried Scrooge joyously. Dear old Ali Baba came to visit that boy sitting there reading. I remember one Christmas when the boy was left here all alone after his classmates had gone home for the holidays. And Ali Baba came to keep him company. And look, there's the genie too. Was this really Ebenezer Scrooge, laughing and crying, excited over friends he had made in his childhood books? Friends who had kept him company when he was deserted by live ones? "And there's the parrot," cried Scrooge. "Poor Robinson Crusoe, home again after sailing around his island. And there goes Friday, running towards the creek." Then Scrooge's voice suddenly took on a tone of pity. "Poor boy," he said of his former self, and began to weep again. I wish, but it's too late now." "What do you wish?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge, "nothing. There was a boy singing Christmas carols at my door last night. I wish I had given him something, that's all." The spirit smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand. "Let us see another Christmas." At those words, Scrooge's former self grew taller, and the schoolroom became darker and dirtier. More windows were cracked. Pieces of plaster had fallen out of the ceiling. More rooms were deserted, and even the chickens no longer strutted through the stables. And the boy was alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the holidays. The boy was not reading now. He was walking up and down in despair. Scrooge, watching this, shook his head sadly and glanced toward the door, remembering what was to come. The door opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in. She threw her arms around the boy's neck and kissed him, calling him, "Dear, dear brother." "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," cried the little girl joyfully. "Home? Dear little Fan?" asked the puzzled boy. "Yes," cried the girl. "Home forever and ever. Father is so much kinder now than he used to be. He speaks so gently to me now that one night I got up the courage to ask him if you could come home, and he said yes, you could. And he sent me in a coach to bring you, and we're going to be together all Christmas and have the merriest time in the world." Fan clapped her hands and laughed. She stood on tiptoe to hug her brother, and she began tugging eagerly at his sleeve, trying to pull him towards the door. "She was a delicate creature," said the spirit to Scrooge, "and she had a good heart." "Yes, she did," said Scrooge. "But she died after she was grown, didn't she?" asked the spirit. "Shortly after she was married and had children?" "One child," answered Scrooge. "Yes," said the spirit, "your nephew Fred." Scrooge seemed uneasy as he answered, "Yes." Although it was only a moment since they had been in the school during the day, Scrooge and the spirit were now transported to a busy, lighted city street. It was evening, and shadowy people came and went, and shadowy carts and coaches battled for space in the roads. Looking around him, Scrooge saw from the decorations in the shops that here, too, it was Christmas. He followed the spirit until its shadowy outline stopped at a warehouse door. "Do you recognize this?" asked the ghost. "Recognize it?" cried Scrooge. "I was apprenticed here." They went inside and saw an old gentleman sitting on a high stool. It was so high that if it had been 2 inches taller, the man's head would have hit the ceiling. "Why, it's old Fezziwig!" cried Scrooge with excitement. "Bless his heart!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock. Seeing that it was 7, he called out in his jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer! Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now a grown young man, hurried into the room, followed by his fellow apprentice. "It's Dick Wilkins, to be sure!" cried Scrooge to the ghost. "He was very close to me. Wilkins was my good friend." "Yo-ho, my boys!" cried Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. It's Christmas Eve, my lads. Let's clear away and have lots of room here." And he skipped down in a single hop from his high desk. Ebenezer and Dick cleared away the desks and swept and washed the floor, while Mr. Fezziwig heaped more coals on the fire. The warehouse was soon snug, warm, and dry, and bright as a party room. In came a fiddler with a music book in hand. When he began to play, his music sounded like 50 stomach aches. but to the boys it was a beautiful orchestra. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, smiling, followed by the 3 lovable Miss Fezziwigs and the young men courting them. In came the men and women who worked in Mr. Fezziwig's warehouse. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook and her friend, the milkman. In came friends, and in came neighbors. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some clumsily, and arms about each other, they frolicked and danced to the fiddler's music. There were cakes and puddings and mince pies and cold beef, and there was hot wine and lots of cold beer. But the high point of the evening came when Mr. Fezziwig stood up to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Despite their age and size, their feet seemed to float on air as they danced more gracefully and with more energy than couples half their age. When the clock struck 11, the party broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig stood at the door, shaking hands with each of their guests and wishing them all a Merry Christmas as they left. When all the guests had gone, the Fezziwigs wished the same Merry Christmas to their 2 apprentices, and the boys headed for their beds in the back room of the warehouse, full of praise for the Fezziwigs. All the while this party scene was taking place, Scrooge watched and acted as if he were part of it as it was happening. He slapped his hands to the music, licked his lips at the food, nodded happily to the guests, and even held out his hand to say farewell to the Fezziwigs. "It cost so little," said the ghost, "to make so many people happy at that party. Fezziwig spent a few pounds, 3 or 4 perhaps. Do you really think he deserves all the praise the boys heaped on him?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, speaking more like his younger, former self. "Fezziwig has the power to make us happy or unhappy, to make our work a pleasure or a burden. No, Spirit, the happiness Fezziwig gives is as great as if it cost a fortune." Realizing that the ghost was staring at him, Scrooge stopped talking. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particularly," answered Scrooge. "I was just thinking that I would like to say a kind word or 2 to my clerk, Bob Cratchit, right now." But at that moment Scrooge and the ghost once again stood side by side in another room, and Scrooge now saw himself as an older man in his 20s, perhaps in the prime of his life. But already his face had begun to show the signs of greed and worry. Now Scrooge was not alone. He sat alongside a pretty young girl. Tears were in her eyes as she spoke to Scrooge's former self. "It doesn't matter to you at all," she said softly, "that another love has replaced me in your heart. And if this love can cheer you and comfort you in the future, as I would have done, then I will not weep and grieve for you." "Good heavens, Belle! What love are you talking about?" asked Scrooge. "What love do you say has replaced you in my heart?" "Gold," she whispered. "For now gold is the only thing you love." "But this is how the world is," said Scrooge. "Nothing is worse than poverty, yet these very same poor people condemn those who seek wealth." "But, Ebenezer," protested Belle, "once you had more noble goals in life, goals which you have cast aside so you could concentrate only on gaining money." "But my feelings toward you have not changed," cried the young man. "We pledged our love a long time ago when we were both poor," she reminded him. "And we agreed to wait until our financial situation improved. When you made the pledge, you were a different man. You have changed, Ebenezer." "I was a boy then," he said impatiently. "We all change in some ways." I have not changed, she said sadly, and so I am releasing you from your promise to marry me. I never asked you to do that, he said. In words, no, she replied, but in your changed attitudes, in your changed goals in life, you have asked me that very thing. Tell me, Ebenezer, if we hadn't known each other all these years, would you now seek me for a wife? Me, a poor girl with no dowry? Scrooge did not reply. No, Ebenezer, you would have nothing to gain by marrying me, no gold to make you richer. This is why, because of the Ebenezer Scrooge I once loved, that I now release you from your promise. The young man started to speak, but the girl turned away from him and continued to speak. This may cause you some pain for a brief time, but you will forget me, just as you forget a bad dream. May you be happy in the life you have chosen. And she stood up and walked away. Ghost, cried Scrooge, do not torture me any more. Take me home. Just one more shadow, said the ghost. No more, cried Scrooge. No more. I don't want to see any more. But the ghost grasped Scrooge's arms and forced him to gaze upon the scene that was appearing before them. They were inside a room, not a large, luxurious room, but a comfortable one, with a cheerful fire burning in the hearth. Next to the fire sat a beautiful girl who looked so much like the girl in the last scene that Scrooge believed that it was the same one until he saw her, Belle, now an attractive matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was deafening, for there were more children than Scrooge could count, but neither mother nor daughter seemed to be bothered about the noise. In fact, they seemed to be enjoying it, even to joining in the children's games. Now a knocking was heard at the door, and all the children rushed toward it, carrying the two laughing women along with them. They all greeted the father, who came home accompanied by a coachman loaded down with toys and Christmas presents. The children shouted with wonder and delight as each gift was opened, and for a long while afterward, the mother and father beamed happily as the children played with their gifts. Then slowly, the tired children began to leave the parlor and go upstairs to bed. And now Scrooge watched more closely as the father, with his daughter leaning lovingly on him, sat down with her and her mother at the fireside. And when Scrooge thought how perhaps that beautiful young girl might have been his daughter, might have brought joy to his life, his eyes grew full with tears. "Spirit!" cried Scrooge in a broken voice. "Take me away from here." "I told you these were shadows of things that are past," said the ghost. "They are what they are. I did not make them happen." "Take me away!" cried Scrooge. "I cannot bear it. Take me back. Stop haunting me." With that, Scrooge grabbed the cap hanging down the ghost's back and quickly pressed it on its head, hoping that by putting out the ghost's light, he could make it go away. But though Scrooge pressed the cap all the way down to the ground over the invisible figure, the light still shone from under it. Scrooge felt exhausted and drowsy. Not sooner had he given the cap one last squeeze than he found himself in his own bedroom. He reeled into bed and fell into a heavy sleep.